Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on linking national and subnational adaptation, vertical integration in National Adaptation Plan processes. So I'm Julie Tang, and I'm a technical specialist on national adaptation plans at the UNDP, the United Nations Development Programme, and I work on the what we call the NAP Global Support Programme, which is a joint UNDP and UN Environment Programme, and is funded by the Global Environmental Facility. We have been mandated to assist developing country governments to identify the technical, institutional, and financial needs to integrate climate change adaptation into national planning. And since 2014, we have been supporting a wide range of developing countries, including LDCs, to advance their NAP processes. This has included direct country support to more than 40 countries, 19 regional workshops, and some knowledge sharing through our website and various global and regional events. And this work contributes to the whole of UNDP's work on nationally determined contributions, where UNDP also plays a strong role. And we also do that through our global portfolio of adaptation and mitigation projects. And as you can see from the slide and from the flyers and invitations, this is a webinar we're organizing with the NAP Global Network, which is a network that connects individuals and institutions working to enhance NAP, the adaptation planning processes and action in developing countries. This network was created in 2014 by adaptation policymakers and practitioners, and it now connects 1,000 participants from more than 130 countries. Among, well, some of you might be among those 1,000 participants. And through these activities, the NAP Global Network facilitates peer learning and exchange. It supports national level action on NAP development and implementation, and it also works to enhance bilateral support for adaptation through donor coordination with developing countries at the table. And the funding for the NAP Global Network is provided by Germany, the United States, Canada, and Austria. So, as you know, today's webinar is focused on vertical integration and is aimed at national adaptation plan teams, but also other stakeholders that are interested in strengthening vertical integration of adaptation. And the reason why we're organizing this is that we think that vertical integration is a key process to advance the NAP process, and it aims at strengthening and creating intentional and strategic linkages between national and subnational adaptation planning, implementation, as well as monitoring and evaluation, because especially cities are some of the biggest emitters. It's about 70% of global greenhouse emissions, also because they generate 80% of the global GDP, and they also account for half of the world's population. And because of this role, cities and vertical integration are really key to achieve the NDCs and to transform the commitments of the NDCs into concrete actions, and by also linking national and local climate change adaptation by planning with private as well as international sources of financing. So what we will do through this webinar today is explore how this can be done. And we will first hear from Angie Daisy from the NAP Global Network Secretariat, who will provide a framing presentation on vertical integration. The second presentation will be by Sophie de Koning, who works for the UN Development Fund on the local climate adaptive living the local climate adaptive living facility. And she's going to give us an overview of climate financing options at the subnational level and look at how this linked to the NAP processes. And finally, we'll have Magdalena Preve from the UNDP country office in Uruguay, who will provide examples from the NAP Cities project, which is funded by the Green Climate Fund in Uruguay. So following the presentations, we will especially like to hear from you. You can ask some questions to the different presenters. There's a little box that you can see on the screen. It will be on the right, where you can ask a question for staff. So please don't hesitate throughout the presentations to ask those questions, which we'll answer at the end of the presentations. And for now, I think we can start, and I'll give the floor to Angie.
Thank you, Julie. I'm going to provide a brief introduction to the concept of vertical integration and share some examples of how countries are putting it into practice in their NAP processes. And just before beginning, I want to apologize in advance in case there's any background noise during my presentation. There's some work being done in my building, and unfortunately, I couldn't do anything about it, so I do apologize for that. So what do we mean when we talk about vertical integration in the NAP process? Basically, we're talking about linking national and subnational adaptation efforts throughout planning, implementation, and monitoring and evaluation. Our definition of vertical integration emphasizes the need for these linkages to be intentional in that they arise from a mandate to engage subnational stakeholders, and they are built into the NAP process from the beginning. We also highlight the need for a strategic approach to vertical integration in terms of building on existing systems and structures, identifying the best entry points, and making efficient use of capacity and resources. Before moving on, I just want to note that when I refer to subnational levels or actors throughout this presentation, I'm referring to all of the levels that exist below the national level, including the subnational government structures in both rural and urban areas, as well as the local community level. So why do we think that vertical integration in NAP processes is so important? There are a few reasons. For starters, relevant decisions under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change provide a strong imperative for engaging subnational actors. For example, the Paris Agreement calls for stronger, more ambitious climate action by cities and other subnational authorities, local communities, and Indigenous peoples. It also highlights the need to enhance capacities at subnational levels and support local communities and Indigenous peoples in responding to climate change. At the same time, there are a number of principles that have been established under the UNFCCC that guide how NAP processes are to unfold. Relevant decisions emphasize the need for adaptation action to be participatory, transparent, and gender responsive, taking vulnerable groups, communities, and ecosystems into consideration. And we feel that vertical integration is fundamental to putting these principles into practice. At a more practical level, it's recognized that much of the implementation of adaptation actions will occur at subnational levels. And this is really critical to ensure that the most vulnerable people of all genders and social groups benefit from investments in adaptation. Finally, we have quite a few years of experience with locally driven approaches to adaptation, such as community-based adaptation, which have generated good results in building individual and community adaptive capacity. All of this means that vertical integration in NAP processes is essential, both to align with the principles and objectives under the convention and to ensure that adaptation efforts are effective, particularly in terms of reaching the most vulnerable people and communities and enhancing ecosystem resilience. When looking at how vertical integration occurs, it's important to keep in mind that, like the NAP process, it must be iterative and tailored to the particular country context. It's most likely that you'll have concurrent things happening on adaptation at the national level and at subnational levels. The key is to ensure that these processes are joined up and are informing each other over time. The way vertical integration unfolds in a particular country will depend on a number of factors. These include the institutional structures that exist or that will be established for adaptation and how these can be organized in a way to facilitate national to subnational linkages. It also depends on the progress on decentralization and the extent to which responsibilities for planning, budgeting, implementation, and so on have been devolved to subnational authorities. And finally, it depends on the existing capacity of different actors at subnational and national levels to work on adaptation, to engage different stakeholders in the process, and to collaborate with each other. This graphic provides an overview of what we are aiming for with vertical integration in NAP processes. The outer circle represents a simplified version of the NAP process, which we have organized into 3 key dimensions: planning, implementation, and monitoring and evaluation. During planning, vertical integration yields mutually supportive adaptation planning processes at national and subnational levels. Vertical integration and implementation leads to coordinated implementation by national and subnational actors. For M&E, it's about ensuring that results and lessons from subnational levels are captured and used in ongoing decision-making and future planning for adaptation. In the center of the circle, we have the enabling factors for the NAP process, which must be in place for everything else to happen. Institutional arrangements are critical to facilitate ongoing dialogue between actors at different levels. Information sharing, including both climate information and information on the NAP process itself, enables coordination and informed decision-making. Capacity development ensures that actors at all levels have the capacities they need for vertical integration to occur. In the case of national stakeholders, this must include capacity to engage subnational stakeholders in inclusive, participatory, and gender-responsive processes, in addition to the technical capacities related to adaptation. I'm now going to share a couple of examples that illustrate how different countries are approaching the challenge of vertical integration. Starting in Ethiopia, where the NAP document focuses on adaptation options and strategic priorities from the national perspective. The document identifies 18 different adaptation options that address climate risks across sectors. It also highlights the key principles that will guide implementation. These include participation, stakeholder empowerment, and equitable implementation. So with the NAP document in place, the Environment, Forest, and Climate Change Commission pursued a two-track approach to begin engaging subnational stakeholders in the process. First, a series of regional workshops were held to raise awareness of the NAP document among subnational stakeholders, build capacity on adaptation, and to undertake an initial participatory prioritization exercise for the adaptation options outlined in the NAP. These workshops brought together government, civil society, and private sector representatives from each of Ethiopia's regions. While this was only an initial step in rolling out the NAP document, the regional engagement has helped to ground truth the plan. For example, all of the regions prioritized the option focusing on food security and climate-smart agriculture, demonstrating that this is a key priority for addressing climate change across the country. The second track was to support integration of adaptation in regional and district level planning through the annual and medium-term planning processes, which also drive the allocation of resources from government budgets. Some guidance have been developed to integrate climate change in planning, but this was done before the NAP was in place and there was limited attention placed on adaptation. So following the development of the NAP, these guidelines have been updated to better address adaptation alongside mitigation and to align with the options that are outlined in the NAP document. And these guidelines are being rolled out as we speak. The results of these two processes, the regional workshops and the guidelines for integrating adaptation into planning, are informing the implementation roadmap for the NAP, which is currently being developed. And obviously, these are only the beginning of the vertical integration process. Additional investment is needed to build subnational capacities on adaptation and obviously to support the implementation of adaptation actions going forward. In Senegal, they have taken a sector-based approach to the NAP process, led by the Ministry of Environment and Sustainable Development. The process is overseen by the National Committee on Climate Change, which is comprised of representatives of different government ministries, private sector, and civil society, including youth and women's groups. To facilitate vertical integration, they have established similar structures at the regional level. These regional committees are also multi-stakeholder bodies with representatives of subnational authorities, community organizations, and the private sector. The first sector to proceed with adaptation planning was the fisheries and aquaculture sector, which is a major employer and source of food for the country. The National Adaptation Planning process for the sector drew on local adaptation plans that had been developed through an internationally funded project. The plans had followed a participatory process and had taken gender into consideration, so they provided a good basis for understanding the context-specific vulnerabilities and adaptation options for fishing communities. These local plans were synthesized through a collaborative process between the regional climate change committees and the regional networks of local fishing councils, and were used to inform the development of the national level plan for the sector. This is an interesting example because it highlights the importance of building on what has already been done at the local level. Though NAP processes often lack the resources to do widespread stakeholder consultations, if participatory processes have already occurred, these can feed important information and perspectives into the national planning processes. It also highlights the critical role played by local organizations in adaptation planning. In this case, having the regional platforms of the local fishing councils involved helped to ensure that the concerns of their members could be heard in decision making. And finally, the example highlights the importance of effective institutional arrangements in creating functional linkages between levels of planning. Having the national and regional climate change committees with a clear relationship between them facilitated information sharing and coordination. And as well, the fact that these core mechanisms for the NAP process include non-governmental actors also increases the diversity of voices heard in the planning. This yielded a relatively efficient process to develop the National Adaptation Plan for the fisheries and aquaculture sector and help to increase ownership of the plan at multiple levels and among different stakeholders. Before closing, I just wanted to highlight that the NAP Global Network has developed a number of resources on vertical integration. We have a guidance note as well as a series of briefs and reports that include country examples, including the example from Senegal that I just mentioned. These are all available in the resources section of our website, which you can find here. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Angie. Next up is Sophie.
Thank you very much, Julie, for handing over the floor. So let me open the presentation.
So if you already have some questions for Angie, you can type them and we'll answer them later. So it's on the right-hand side of your screen normally. Please, Sophie.
Thank you. So my name is Sophie de Koning. I'm the Global Program Manager for the Local Climate Adaptive Living Facility with UNCDF. So for those who don't know UNCDF, it's the UN Capital Development Fund, which has a capital mandate and financial instruments offering last mile finance models to unlock public and private resources, especially at the domestic level. So in this context, UNCDF has designed and established the Local Climate Adaptive Living Facility, which is one way of addressing sub-national adaptation in a systemic manner. So I will share our experience with the facility. So the starting point from piloting and designing the local mechanism was the fact that many local authorities are mandated with climate sensitive sectors, but face challenges in fulfilling their roles due to a number of constraints. So first, they lack some capacities to integrate climate change into local public planning and budgeting processes, and that may be linked to also sometimes the lack of data or local climate risk assessment. Second, there is a lack of financing for revenue generating private or public-private adaptation projects. And third, the sources of climate finance are generally available mainly through national programs or national government. And it's a challenge for many local authorities to access climate finance. So using the experience of UNCDF with fiscal decentralization from the last 20 plus years, in 2011, we have started piloting a mechanism to channel climate finance to local authorities. So as you can see from the diagram, the funds are channeled from international or domestic sources through central government using the same mechanism as other intergovernmental fiscal transfers. They are transferred together with other regular capital grants when such grants exist in the countries as a top-up in the range of 10 to 20%, which can be more, especially in countries where such regular transfers are limited or non-existent. So the grants are channeled to the local government, and then they can be used together with other sources so that the portfolio of climate relevant investment under the legal mandates of the local governments can be made resilient. That is the first part of the diagram. If you look at the bottom of the diagram, those are other elements. So the way it works is that local authorities are first expected to meet a series of minimum conditions, which are generally linked to good governance or financial management. Those are basic safeguards to ensure the basic capacities are in place and that there is no misuse of funds from year to year, because the minimum conditions are assessed every year. Then the local governments enter into an agreement to work against a set of pre-agreed target indicators, which we call performance measures, that include both local governance, public financial management, and climate change adaptation indicators. They work for 1 year using their grants against those objectives, and each year there is an independent assessment of the performance, which we call the annual performance assessment, which then informs both the technical and capacity building support, as well as the size of the following year's performance-based grants. So the mechanism was first introduced in Cambodia and Bhutan in 2011. From 2014 onwards, other countries started joining the mechanism in Asia and the Pacific and in Africa. Countries go through what we call a phased approach. In phase 1, countries go through a small-scale pilot with 3 to 5 local governments during 1, 2, or 3 cycles of investment, so that the various elements of the mechanism that are tailor-made can be fine-tuned and tested. So those elements, referring to the earlier slides, include the financial circuit, the minimum conditions, performance measures, as well as a menu of investment that will guide the local authorities in selecting their investment each year. Bhutan and Cambodia, which started first, are now going through what we call phase 3, which is the national scale out, using budget support in the case of Bhutan and various sources of project funding in the case of Cambodia. Both of them, as well as other countries which are consolidating their efforts in phase 2, such as Benin, but also Mali and Tanzania, are working towards accreditation to the Green Climate Fund for direct access, with the view that the government, the central government, will then scale up using co-financing from the Green Climate Fund. So the mechanism has been reviewed and documented in a set of guidelines that is available online and being translated also in French. So those guidelines provide bring the reader through the various steps in setting up and deploying such mechanism, in particular the performance-based grant system, which is at its core. What is important to know is that it's fully built on existing government processes and structures while trying to strengthen them rather than creating other structures or parallel processes. And those guidelines were approved by the least developed countries expert group at the UNFCCC as supplementary material to the NAP technical guidelines in April earlier this year. So next are just country examples. Like I mentioned, Cambodia is now going to phase 3 to 50 districts with co-financing from the Asian Development Bank, IFAD, and UNDP, and the assistance still of the UNCDF local facility for technical assistance and quality assurance. We are also working with the National Secretariat for Decentralization for the accreditation to the Green Climate Fund, so that through direct access, they could further scale up the mechanism. Knowing the countries includes 159 districts. Another example, one of the newest programs is Lesotho, which is in phase 1 with the piloting happening in 4 local councils, just starting now with support from the European Union. So thank you very much. That was the presentation. I just would like to acknowledge also the partners of the mechanism, which includes the European Union, Global Climate Change Alliance, the Swedish corporation SIDA, the Belgian corporation, the government of Liechtenstein, Italian corporation, the government of Andorra, as well as several governments from the participating countries, which are co-financing the mechanism directly themselves, including Benin, Bangladesh, Cambodia, and Mali. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sophie. Again, if you want to ask some questions, please start typing them, while I give the floor to Magdalena, who will present the case of Uruguay.
Hi, good morning to everyone. I would like to thank you for the opportunity of presenting Uruguay's experiences regarding linking national and subnational adaptation and the vertical integration in the National Adaptation Plan processes. As you can see in the photo, Uruguay is located in the southern corner of South America. We define ourselves as a small country relatively to our neighbors that are Argentina and Brazil, and are very large land areas. As you can see, Uruguay has 175,000 square kilometers. We have a coastline of 680 kilometers, and our population is 3.3 million people. And most of our people, 93%, live in urban areas and 70% in the coastal zones. In the recent year, the country has faced many more frequent and intense floods and droughts over the past decade than in previous years. And for example, in 2015, 20,000 people were displaced from 3 cities in the north of the country due to storms that caused widespread damage and economic losses. But also that same year, a prolonged drought caused significant losses in the agricultural sector, which along with tourism represents a significant part of the Uruguayan economy. Having said that, I would like to say that Uruguay is a high economic, social, and has a high economic and social and political stability. We are ranked 55 out of 189 in the Human Development Index. Uruguay is a consolidated democracy at the forefront of the rights agenda, and is one of the most egalitarian societies in Latin America, as you can see by our Gini index. This stable nature of our economic and political system has allowed the government to construct public policies to tackle climate change and move towards carbon neutral development. So we had climate change adaptation established as our national strategic priority, both in our national climate change policy and in our nationally determined contribution, which of course is part of Uruguay's Paris Agreement commitments. The national policy of climate change provides the general framework for the sectoral national adaptation plans and the NDC. As you may see, Uruguay had taken an approach of sectoral national adaptation plans, and adaptation commitments in our NDC include the formulation and implementation of an app for cities and infrastructure, an app for coastal zones, an app for agriculture, an app energy, and an app health. experience I would like to present for you today is the experience from the NAP cities and infrastructure to advance the NAP process for urban areas. The Uruguay government carries out this project known as NAP cities that is led by the Ministry of Housing, Land Management and Environment and is funded by the Green Climate Fund and implemented by UNDP in Uruguay. The NAP cities objectives are to develop the adaptive capacity and resilience of urban centers and those who live there, of course, to protect infrastructure and urban environments, and integrate adaptation into national and local planning. By this project, we have a project team composed at this time of more than 15 professionals that are working together with the ministry staff in adaptation of mainstream adaptation into national and local planning. So NAP cities works within the ministry to incorporate climate change considerations into environmental, territorial development, water and housing policies. It also acts as a mechanism for collaboration of the central and local governments in urban policies. And by this, it identifies land use planning as a key instrument for climate change adaptation. And here is where we encounter the first element of vertical integration of national and subnational planning through the implementation of the different instruments arising from the national law of land planning and sustainable development, for example, like the sectoral guidelines and the local land use plans. The national government, through the Ministry of Housing and Planning and Environment, supports and collaborates with the subnational governments in the development of their local land use plans. And now, with the support of the NAP Cities project, they will incorporate adaptation to climate change into these plans. So, as I said before, Uruguay has identified land use planning as a key instrument for climate change adaptation. Land use planning allows the detection of hazards and implementation of measures to reduce vulnerability and risk through the planning of uses, transformations, and recovering of the territory to improve the quality of life of the population, to preserve natural resources and territorial conditions for sustainable development. And one of these key instruments are local land use plans. Local land use plans are detailed planning tools. Due to their territorial scope and the specificity of proposals, they represent the most appropriate instrument for the incorporation of measures to reduce vulnerability and respond to climate change. And by integrating adaptation to climate change into local land use plans, allows its integration by the different management areas and multiple stakeholders involved in the territories. But how can we mainstream climate change into the local plans? To effectively mainstream adaptation in urban and territorial planning, it should be informed by assessment of multiple hazards. For that purpose, the NAP Cities project will develop multi-hazard risk assessments considering future climate change scenarios to provide an estimation of evolving or future risk in 4 urban areas that are currently developing or updating their local land use plans. These urban areas are presented in the slide and are the city of Canelones, the city of Rivera, the city of Juan Lacase, and the Pantanoso Basin urban area inside Montevideo City, the capital of our country. To carry out these multi-hazard risk assessments, collaboration partnerships have been established with the local governments, by the ministry and with the local governments through the NAP Cities project. And just to inform, the main milestones of the assessment are, for example, the inception workshop and linking with the local plan. Another workshop to identify and zoning hazards, and as you may see, this is a participatory process. Then a workshop to identify vulnerabilities and risks. Then a workshop for the presentation of recommendations for adaptation measures. And finally, the development of a methodological guide to incorporate an adaptation approach to land use planning that will be developed. This will allow other local governments to develop their own multi-hazard risk assessments and mainstream adaptation in their local planning. So this was an example of how collaboration within national and local governments. Another example of integrating national and sub-national adaptation within the NAP-Cities project is the collaboration with the local government of the city of Paysandú to develop a pilot adaptation plan for a medium flat risk zone to be implemented by an adaptation fund finance project. So this pilot included a socioeconomic and household survey, adaptation measures recommendations, and costs and financing options for every household inside this medium flat risk zone. So this allows for a smooth implementation of this adaptation fund finance project. And it's another example of how this process of planning from the national perspective goes to the planning with the local governments to implement, to plan and to implement adaptation measures. Another activity I would like to share with you is that to measure urban adaptation progress, NAP-Cities has designed a system of 25 indicators in 5 dimensions: public spaces and green soil, infrastructure and buildings, social systems, governance and responsiveness, education, knowledge and information. These indicators link the NAP-Cities with the National Climate Change Policy, with the NDC, the Sendai Framework, and the 2030 Agenda. So if anyone is interested in any of these results or these studies, we have comprehensive reports and presentations that have been produced and published at national level. So to finalize, I would like to say that NAP-Cities is not only helping the country to fulfill its commitments under the 2015 Paris Agreement, but is working together with national and local governments to climate-proof their national and local plans, therefore contributing to the long-term vision for a resilient Uruguay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Magdalena. Again, I would urge you to ask some questions if you have any for Angie or Magdalena or Sophie. And so some of the key messages that I have heard today were that vertical integration is key to adaptation mainstreaming because implementation is done at subnational level. And there is a need to look at different levels from the planning to the implementation to the monitoring and evaluation. And this whole work at subnational level can fit into the national level planning. And from the second presentation, we heard about some of the key challenges for local authorities to contribute to climate change, and some were especially related to finance. And that's what the project presented by Sophie is trying to address with some fiscal transfer mechanisms that can be used at local level to leverage resources and scale up local level adaptation investments. And those would be, for instance, the performance-based grants that she mentioned. And for Magdalena, we heard about a great example of a project funded by the GCF under this NAP readiness window, and that looks specifically at cities and using all the key issues around adaptation planning, but at cities level, and especially mainstreaming into local development plans. So to start the discussion, I will start maybe with the questions that we received, which were, I think, all so far about the presentation made by Sophie. So the first question I will ask is from Benin and Ghana. When was phase 1 and was it after 2017? Sophia will ask you the other questions related to the project as well, about readiness in these 2 countries, and was that considered phase 1, and was it considered a test, and maybe how will that be followed up? And also again for Benin and Ghana, what is the relation to the GCF concept note and the full proposal that Benin has prepared? Sophie, if you want to answer some of those on Benin and Ghana in particular.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, Julie. So for Benin, okay, so in Africa, we had a launch workshop in 2013, and Benin was designed as well as Ghana in 2014, signed around those dates. Benin started implementing as of 2015 with the first cycle, and from 2016 onwards, the government of Benin started co-financing through the National Fund for Environment and Climate. So the link with the concept note that are put forward to the Green Climate Fund is that indeed the local facility worked with Benin as well as Cambodia and Mali to prepare concept note as part of the Enhanced Direct Access initiative. And back then, the National Environmental Fund for Environment and Climate was not accredited yet. They were this year in February, so we are working closely with them to upgrade the design of the mechanism so that it can be ready for larger scale up. We're looking now at about 30 communes. That is for Green Climate Fund. We have also dialogue ongoing with development partners in Benin, whereby we think that budget support for decentralization could also be another source of finance for scaling it up. So that is for Benin. And for Ghana, the design took place around the same time, 2013 and 14. It was possibly a bit more complex to launch the mechanism in Ghana because of the mainstream system that we were somehow aligning with. Nevertheless, we did a pilot in 3 districts, and we are just now finishing the upgrade of the design because the mechanism will be brought to another 10 districts in another 2 other regions. The link with the readiness, I'm not sure whether I understand the question fully, but we are working closely with a number of countries. Maybe it has to go with the support I mentioned about helping some of the entities involved in local with their accreditation to the Green Climate Fund. The readiness followed the pilot in the case of the Cambodia, or the support for the accreditation. The nomination of the NCDDS, National Secretariat in Cambodia, I believe took place a few years after the pilot started. So, and one is not a prerequisite for the other. There are countries that are certainly far from direct access where we are committed to still help and deploy the mechanism. And there are others that are actually pursuing the 2 tracks, so the piloting and consolidation of the mechanism, as well as work towards direct access. So I hope it answers the question. Otherwise, I can provide more information. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Actually, while you're talking about your program, could you also maybe highlight for us what you see in terms of advantages and strengths in working with local authorities and their specific power to leverage climate finance?
Thank you, Julie. So the advantages we see in working with local authorities, I mean, first, we think it's the right thing to do, considering the fact that, as was pointed out by Angie, many of the adaptation efforts and the mechanism is primarily focused on adaptation are happening at the local level. We see that local authorities know their territories very well. They are used in many cases to participatory planning, and they have the mandate and responsibilities to work on many of the climate sensitive sectors, like I was mentioning. They have this somehow local convening power that can be leveraged. And like I said, they understand the complexity and the local challenges. The other advantages is that they're part of the government structures. So it means that the good practices that might be tested or deployed in one part of the country can be replicated in others, and especially because they're part of the government structure in terms of financial flows, the scalability is really possible. So Bhutan has now 50 GWOCs, part of the mechanism. By next year, it's going to be 100 GWOCs, which is roughly half of the local governments. Cambodia, I mentioned, is already 50 out of 157. Benin, with their efforts towards GCF, will be 30 plus communes out of 77. So that is, we think, a very important advantage. And it's also compatible with working closely with communities. Indeed, the performance measures often integrate, or almost always integrate, performance measures related to participation, gender issues, and other important cross-cutting issues for adapting to climate change. So those are the main advantages. We see the relevance mandate, but also the scalability, so that eventually climate finance can be channeled through large portion of a country, if not all the country, through such system. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Then there were some questions for Magdalena on the Uruguay example. So one is, from your experience, what are the political incentives that mayors have to adapt their territories? And the second question is there any report documenting the process of planning and highlighting obstacles encountered in the development of those plans?
Well, first of all, regarding the first question, the political incentives, I think that it was in Uruguay's experience, it was key that the national climate change policy recognized adaptation as a key strategic adaptation and NAPs as a key strategic instruments to respond to climate change. I think that well, that was for the very high level a national policy to recognize that, and then to materializing that in the NDC. And Uruguay's NDC includes NAPs as a commitment, and with specific targets to formulating and implementing the different NAPs. The 5 NAPs that I presented while in my presentation. So that I think that are very high political incentives to forward and to the NAP process. The other question, sorry, can you repeat that for me?
Yeah, the second question is whether there are reports.
Yes, well, yes, I can share with in the presentation. Maybe I can add a link to the website where we are presenting all the reports that are produced by NAP cities, but also for another from another NAPs that we are supporting in Uruguay. For example, the NAP for the agriculture sector, and in the process we of course include lessons learned and different challenges that were encountered. So yes, I can share these links, and so you can find the different reports and studies and read about it more deeply.
Thank you very much. Could you specify whether that's on a specific website of UNDP in Uruguay or?
Well, I can share with you later so you can forward it. Some of them are within UNDP website in Uruguay, another in the Ministry of Housing, Land Planning and Environment that also has a website with the different documents of the project and Also, for example, for the NAP agriculture, we have another dedicated website to present all the documents. So maybe I can forward it to you, and you can then share with the assistants to this webinar where to find it.
Yes, thank you very much. There was another question for you, actually. What is the participation of communities in planning and budgeting of adaptation plans? And how much of their experience and the traditional knowledge and practices are taken into account? For instance, is that done through local representation government? Are those communities participating in assessments, budget preparation, or monitoring?
Well, in the case of the NAP cities, and in these four local areas that we are working on, of course, we are, for example, we have this month workshops in the cities of Canelones and in the city of Rivera, and all the community was invited, not only from the local government, not only the planners, but also the community, so as to include and to incorporate local knowledge. And I would like also, it was not experience that I presented, but also the NAP agriculture that it will be presented this afternoon in Uruguay also incorporates, it was also a participatory process throughout all the country, and it also includes the traditional knowledge and practices, and it also had workshops with women in rural areas, and a lot of recommendations, and including all from traditional knowledge and local practices, not only those from the central and local planners, but including all that. So yes, it was included, and it was very rich to have these very participatory processes in the preparation of the agriculture NAP, and I think it will be also enrich the NDC cities process.
Thank you very much. Next questions, maybe for Angie. Could you explain what the difference between mainstreaming and vertical integration is?
Sure. So these are obviously closely related concepts, but different. So one of the aims of the NAP process is to integrate or mainstream adaptation in development planning across sectors and levels. So vertical integration in the NAP process can really facilitate this by creating a framework, identifying options for adaptation, and putting systems and structures in place to mainstream adaptation at the subnational levels. And then because this is an iterative process, through the process of integrating adaptation in subnational planning, governments can gain a better understanding of what the issues and priorities are at those subnational levels, be it regional, district, local community. And then this can help to inform future updates to the NAP. So I think that mainstreaming and vertical integration are really sort of mutually reinforcing processes.
Thank you. Another question that you might be able to help answer is the question about the governance and whether, so there's a lack of coordination, which you pointed out at various levels of governance. Could you give us some recommendations based on your experience on how this can be addressed? Other people, maybe Sophie or Magdalena, could also step in.
Sure. I mean, I think there are a lot of reasons for that lack of coordination. I mean, one of the things that Sophie highlighted was capacities of subnational authorities. I think they are often very overstretched and have a lot of demands on them, and that can create challenges in sort of addressing the additional complexity that's brought in through adaptation. And I think that because adaptation it's a cross-cutting issue, it's not limited to a single sector, that also can lead to challenges in coordination, because, for example, in some countries, not all sectors are represented at, or not all ministries, sorry, are represented at the subnational level. So I guess my recommendation first would be to try to understand what are the reasons for a lack of coordination between different levels of governance, because I think it is really a case-by-case basis as to the best way to approach this, and then finding the best entry point. So depending on the country, different solutions may make the most sense depending on where the country is in its NAP process, what progress has been made on decentralization, all of these different issues that sort of create openings and opportunities to do a better job of coordinating across levels.
Thank you. And there was another question for you on the case of Ethiopia, and what has been done to mainstream CCA in development planning at the national level that has been scaled down at the local level, and how has local adaptation planning informed the national level planning?
I'll try to be really brief because we're running out of time. I think, as I mentioned, the mainstreaming at the local level is sort of an ongoing process. I think there have been lots of efforts made under different initiatives, and now what they're trying to do is to learn from those experiences and apply that learning in the context of the NAP process. So trying to make it more of a systematic thing rather than something that has been driven by different projects or initiatives. So having these new guidelines in place are really important because those are core guidelines that will be applied by the WAREDAs, the district level governments. And that's a key planning process for driving allocation of resources at the subnational level. So it's an ongoing process, but they're really treating it also as an iterative process and trying to apply learning as they go.
Okay, thank you very much. Then maybe there was another question for Sophie. Do you also find that local authorities are changing or adjusting in response to the local process? And for instance, that would be increase in transparency or accountability to local constituents.
Thank you very much for the question. We've started, I mean, the performance-based grant system is meant to somehow compare local authorities from year to year in order to inform the capacity building and the size of the grants for the next year. This being said, we've started also looking at the progression of some local authorities. We might miss a bit of the historical trend, but we do see improvement. I mean, the extreme case is where a local authority cannot meet the minimum condition for the next year. So definitely there is work that is being undertaken. And in general, local authorities are quite fast in addressing any issue that is somehow putting them off the mechanism for a few months, or the risk to actually miss a full year, because all the local authorities embark on the cycle together simultaneously. And also in terms of transparency and accountability, it's typically part of the performance measures. So there is an incentive for them to work on that. And if they want to focus on that, there is also support provided in terms of capacity building and technical assistance. So we find that this performance system, putting somehow the local authorities in a sort of competition, creates a positive emulation amongst them. So our experience is positive on adaptation, but also the performance-based grant approach has been used for local development for 20 plus years. So it's been adapted now to the issue of climate change adaptation, but there is a long-lasting experience in designing and using this kind of mechanism. So that would be my answer to this question. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sophie. So we've come to the end of our hour. So I would like to thank our presenters, Angie, Sophie, and Magdalena, for their really interesting presentations and really insightful answers to the questions posed by the attendees. So as we mentioned, this webinar has been recorded and it will be posted on the NAP GSP and the NAP Global Network's websites. We'll also post the PowerPoint presentations that you have seen, and you can watch them again, or you can share them with other people. And if you have more questions, you can also share them with us. At the end of this webinar, there'll be a short evaluation survey that you should launch on your screen, and that we'll also share with you by email. And we would really appreciate if you could take a couple of minutes to fill that in and give us some feedback. So just quickly, to close, there are different ways you can get in touch with us at the NAP Global Support Program or at the NAP Global Network. The NAP Global Network has their website, which appears on your screen now. And you can register and take a look at the different information, where there are different updates on the webinars, publication, and knowledge products, and in general NAP-related news. And similarly, on the Global Support Program website of the NAP GSP, you can see all our country pages, which present the different progress that countries have made. We also put information on our different regional trainings and all the publications and all the resources that we have. So please don't hesitate to get in touch with us, both at the NAP Global Network and the NAP GSP. And please send us more questions and let us know if you want to get more involved and learn more from us. Thank you.